King George V of the United Kingdom ruled as the monarch of the United Kingdom from 1910 to 1936, and his sons played significant roles in the shaping of the history of the British royal family. In this video, we will explore the lives and legacies of King George V's sons. Edward VIII was born on the 23rd of June 1894 during the reign of his great-grandmother, Queen Victoria. He was the eldest child of the then Duke and Duchess of York, the future George V and Queen Mary. At birth, he was third in the line of succession. He went by his last given name, David. David and his younger siblings were brought up by nannies, and his parents were not overly affectionate with their children. However, his parents did love them. One of David's earliest nannies was abusive towards the children, and after her maltreatment of the children was discovered, she was replaced by the loving Charlotte Bill. David was tutored at home by various tutors, and when his parents travelled to the British Empire for 9 months in 1901, after the death of Queen Victoria, David and his siblings stayed with their grandparents, Queen Alexandra and King Edward VII in Britain. At the age of 13, David passed his examination to enter the Royal Naval College and began there in 1907. Following 2 years at the Royal Naval College in Osborne, David moved on to the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth. David was withdrawn from the Naval College and placed aboard the battleship Hindustan as a midshipman. Following this, he entered Magdalene College in Oxford, which he was unprepared for academically. After 8 terms, he left Oxford without any qualifications. David was officially invested as the Prince of Wales on the 13th of July 1911 at Carnarvon Castle in Wales. The ceremony was invented by the Welsh politician David Lloyd George, and he coached David to say a few words in Welsh. During the First World War, David hoped to fight on the front lines, but was refused. Despite this, David witnessed trench warfare and visited the front lines as much as possible. He was popular among veterans of the conflict. David learned how to pilot planes and gained a pilot's license in 1918. In January 1919, David's youngest sibling John died from an epileptic seizure. David was much older than John and hardly knew him, so he did not grieve for his brother's death, as one would expect a brother to. In the 1920s, David represented his father at home and abroad. He gained much public attention for his good looks, rank, and bachelor status. He was incredibly popular. Due to his good looks and charming personality, David had many admirers. Several became his mistresses. One such mistress was Marguerite Alibert, whom he met in 1917. They had a relationship for a year before David broke it off. In 1923, Alibert was acquitted of murder charges after she shot her husband. Efforts were made by the royal household to ensure that David's name was not mentioned in connection to Alibert. Other women David had relationships with included Frida Dudley Ward, Lady Furness, and Wallis Simpson. David's womanizing worried the Prime Minister and the King. George V was disgusted and disappointed in David. David soon became infatuated with a woman known as Wallis Simpson, an American socialite who had been twice divorced. Simpson and David's relationship worsened David's already poor relationship with his parents. On the 20th of January 1936, George V died and David ascended the throne as Edward VIII. During his 11 months as king, David paid little attention to his constitutional duties. The government were reluctant to send confidential papers to David, as they feared David would allow others to read them. David broke with tradition when it came to the coins. When a new monarch comes to the throne, they have their portrait taken and their image is stamped onto coins. Each successive monarch faces the opposite direction to their predecessor on the coins. David insisted that he face left, as his father had, to show off his hair parting. Only a handful of these coins existed. In July 1936, an assassin named Jerome Bannigan attempted to kill David with a loaded gun. David was unharmed and Bannigan was soon arrested. During the autumn of 1936, David and Wallace cruised the Mediterranean, and by October it became clear that David was planning to marry Wallace. In November, David expressed his desire to marry Wallace to the Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. Baldwin informed him that this was unacceptable in the church and that people would not tolerate Wallace as queen. David proposed an alternative solution. Wallace would not be queen consort, but she would enjoy a lesser title like princess or duchess, and any children they might have would not inherit the throne. This was supported by some senior politicians like Winston Churchill, but ultimately was rejected by the government. Because he was not allowed to marry Wallace, David abdicated on the 11th of December 1936. The following day, David left Britain for Austria. His brother Albert succeeded him as George VI. David would be known only as the Duke of Windsor and reverted back to his princely title and style. David married Wallace on the 3rd of June 1937 in France. The king forbade any members of the royal family from attending, and Wallace was denied the style of Her Royal Highness. This caused lasting resentment from the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. David owned Sandringham House and Balmoral Castle, having inherited them as private properties from George V. George VI bought them from David so that they would stay in the hands of the monarch and the royal family. For years after the abdication, the relationship between the Duke and his family remained strained, and David was not allowed to return to Britain. David and Wallace settled in France. In October 1937, David and Wallace visited Nazi Germany and met Adolf Hitler. This went against the advice of the British government. At the outbreak of war, the Duke and Duchess were brought back to Britain. They eventually returned to France the following year, and when Germany invaded, they fled to Biarritz and then to Spain. In July 1940, they moved to Portugal, and that same month, David was appointed governor of the Bahamas. They travelled there in August 1940 and stayed until 1945. David supported Hitler and had Nazi sympathies. The Marburg files detailed a plot by the Nazis to have the Duke join their side and have him reinstated as king with Wallace as queen. They also had letters written by the Duke to Hitler in which he encouraged relentless bombing of the United Kingdom. These letters were recovered by US troops from Germany in May 1945. After the war, the couple returned to France and remained there for the rest of their lives. Neither held another official role. They effectively became celebrities, hosting parties and travelling between Paris and New York. The Duke and Duchess were not invited to the coronation of Elizabeth II in 1953. Many members of the royal family never forgave Wallace. Queen Mary refused to meet her, and the Queen Mother never forgave her for causing the abdication. In the 1960s, the Duke and Duchess did attend events in the UK. They attended the centenary of Queen Mary's birth in 1967 and the memorial service of the Princess Royal in 1967 also. They refused an invitation to attend the investiture of Charles, Prince of Wales, citing that Charles would not want to have an aged aunt and uncle there. In the 1960s, the Duke's health deteriorated, and he had operations on an aneurysm and a detached retina. In 1971, the Duke was diagnosed with throat cancer and underwent treatment. The Queen visited the couple in May 1972, and 10 days later, on the 28th of May 1972, David died. His body was returned to Britain, but he was not given a state funeral due to the abdication. David was buried in the royal burial ground at Frogmore. His wife died in 1986 and was also buried alongside him. George VI was born at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate during the reign of his great-grandmother, Queen Victoria. Born on the 14th of December 1895, the 34th anniversary of the death of his great-grandfather. He was named in honour of him, going by the name of Albert. Albert was often ill and was more sensitive than his siblings. Albert developed a stammer that would last for the rest of his life. Due to knock-knees, Albert was forced to wear painful corrective splints. In 1909, Albert attended the Royal Naval College, coming last in his class in 1911. Albert progressed to the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth nonetheless. In 1910, his grandfather died and his father became George V. In 1913, Albert spent 6 months on the training ship HMS Cumberland, working as a midshipman. 3 weeks after the outbreak of the First World War, Albert was evacuated from the ship to Aberdeen, where he had his appendix removed. During the war, Albert saw little combat due to ill health caused by a duodenal ulcer, which was operated on in 1917. Albert served in the Royal Air Force. He qualified as an RAF pilot in 1919 and was promoted to squadron leader. That year, Albert entered Trinity College, where he studied history, economics and civics for a year. In 1920, he was created the Duke of York and began to take on more royal duties representing his father. Due to his stammer and shyness, he appeared less confident in public than his older brother David. Unusual for the time, Albert was given freedom to choose a wife. In 1920, Albert developed an infatuation with a married socialite called Lady Lochborough. He put an end to the relationship after being promised a dukedom. That year, he met Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon for the first time since childhood. He fell in love with her and proposed to her 3 times. The first 2 times, Elizabeth rejected his proposal, as she was reluctant to give up her freedom to become a member of the royal family. Eventually, Elizabeth agreed to marry him, and they were wed on the 26th of April, 1923. They had 2 children together, Elizabeth and Margaret, born in 1926 and 1930 respectively. They lived in London and led a quiet life. From 1925, Albert began to see Lionel Logue, a speech therapist, to help him with his stammer. In 1936, George V died, and after less than a year on the throne, his successor and Albert's brother, Edward VIII, abdicated his throne. Albert, as first in line, became George VI, taking that regnal name to emphasize continuity with his father. Albert invested his wife with the Order of the Garter on his 41st birthday. George VI's coronation was held in Westminster Abbey on the 12th of May 1937, and in a break with tradition, Queen Mary, Albert's mother, attended the ceremony to show support for her son. In 1939, the King and Queen toured Canada and the United States, becoming the first reigning monarch of Britain to visit North America. The trip was a success, with the King and Queen being received enthusiastically by the public. It forged a strong bond of friendship between the US President and the British monarch. War was declared in September 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. George VI and Queen Elizabeth stayed in Buckingham Palace while their daughters moved to Windsor Castle. They refused to evacuate from London. During the Blitz in September 1940, the King and Queen narrowly escaped death when 2 German bombs exploded in the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, damaging part of the palace. The British royal family were also subjected to rationing and the same deprivations as the rest of the country. The King and Queen provided morale to the public, visiting affected areas throughout the UK. During George VI's reign, much of the British Empire dissolved, with many countries becoming independent nations. The Statute of Westminster of 1931 acknowledged that the Dominions were separate sovereign states. The Empire became a voluntary association of independent states known as the Commonwealth. Britain partitioned India into two independent countries, India and Pakistan, in 1947, and both countries left the Commonwealth. George VI relinquished the title of Emperor of India. Many other countries also left the Commonwealth. The stress of becoming king and the stress of the war hastened the decline of the king's health. The king smoked heavily and developed lung cancer and Buerger's disease, as well as other ailments associated with smoking. His wife, children, and son-in-law, the Duke of Edinburgh, represented the king when he was ill. His eldest daughter, Elizabeth, and her husband, Philip, went on tour to Australia via Kenya at his request. He saw them off from London Airport, and this would be his last public appearance. He passed away 6 days later on the 6th of February 1952. His daughter flew back to the UK upon hearing of his death. The lying in state occurred from the 11th of February, and his funeral took place 4 days later on the 15th of February. He was buried in the Royal Vault before being transferred to the King George VI Memorial Chapel. Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, was born on the 31st of March 1900 at York Cottage. He was nicknamed Harry by his family. Like his brother Albert, Henry had knock-knees and speech impediments. He was also an anxious child who was prone to crying or giggling when nervous. Henry also suffered from poor health and was prone to colds. In 1910, Henry's father ascended the throne as George V. Up to this point, Henry had been educated at home, as was expected of a royal prince. However, the king was persuaded by Henry's tutor, Henry Hansel, to send him to school. Henry became the first son of a British monarch to attend school. He attended St. Peter's Court School as a boarder. He was good at mathematics and loved sports like cricket and football. He also attended Eton College from September 1913, and while he did not excel at academics, his anxiety eased and he made many friends. In 1919, Henry attended Trinity College, Cambridge, with his brother Albert. At Trinity College, they were not allowed to live with the other undergraduates, as their father feared they would mix with the people he deemed unworthy. In 1919, Prince Henry joined the army and attended the Royal Military College of Sandhurst. He gained the rank of a second lieutenant that same year and was promoted to lieutenant in 1921. As a senior member of the royal family, Henry was unable to be an active soldier in the army. In 1927, he was promoted to captain, and in 1929, he was appointed aide-de-camp to his father. On the 31st of March 1928, Henry's father created him Duke of Gloucester, Earl of Ulster and Baron Culloden. Later that year, Henry travelled with his brother David to Nairobi to shoot animals. After some time, David and Henry parted ways. While there, Henry began an affair with Beryl Markham. Henry returned to England in November 1928 with Beryl following. They continued their affair, with Prince Henry often hosting parties openly with her. The King and the Queen were shocked by his actions, and the King stepped in. He believed that keeping Henry busy would be the best way to stop the affair, and so he arranged a number of tours for Henry to undertake. Henry travelled to Japan and Ethiopia in 1929 and 1930 respectively. In 1934, he was made a Knight of St. Patrick, and he travelled to Australia and New Zealand that year. After his trip to Japan in 1929, Henry and Beryl's affair ended. Mansfield, Beryl's husband, wanted a divorce. and threatened to use Henry's letters to Beryl as evidence in the divorce. Henry was blackmailed into providing an annual allowance to Beryl so that the letters would not be used as evidence. Beryl and Henry never met again. In 1935, Henry was appointed Colonel-in-Chief of the Gloucestershire Regiment and substantive rank of Major. Prince Henry felt pressured by his parents to settle down. It was through his friend Lord William Montagu Douglas Scott that he met his future wife, Lady Alice Montagu Douglas Scott. Alice and William were siblings. Alice also felt the need to settle down and marry. Both were in their middle 30s and had known each other for years. In 1935, Prince Henry proposed to Alice and she accepted. They were originally supposed to wed at Westminster Abbey, but due to Alice's father's death in October 1935, only weeks before the wedding, they moved the venue to the private chapel at Buckingham Palace. They married on the 6th of November 1935. Henry and Alice lived at the Royal Pavilion in Aldershot before moving to Barnwell Manor in 1938. While in London, they lived at York House in St James's Palace. Alice suffered 2 miscarriages before giving birth to their first son William in 1941 and their second son Richard in 1944. In 1936, after his father's death, he was appointed aide-de-camp to his brother King Edward VIII. Later in December 1936, King Edward VIII abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson. Their brother Albert ascended the throne as King George VI. Due to Albert's children being too young, Henry could act as regent for his brother, and because of this he was not allowed to leave the United Kingdom at the same time as his brother. On the 1st of January 1937, Henry retired from active duty and received a ceremonial rank of Major General. Up to this point, Henry had led a somewhat carefree life. Albert warned his brothers Henry and George that they would not be able to live as they had and would need to step up. Henry and Albert became closer after the abdication. The king trusted Henry with important matters of state, and Henry supported his brother. When the Second World War broke out, Henry joined the British Expeditionary Force and was appointed Chief Liaison Officer. He spent the first year of the war in France. During this time, he provided detailed, objective reports of what was happening to government officials and the king. In 1940, he was appointed as Colonel of the Ulster Anti-Aircraft Regiment, the Royal Artillery, and the Territorial Army. Henry was friends with King Leopold III of Belgium, and in May 1940, Henry and William, his brother-in-law, met with the Belgian king to offer support when it seemed like Belgium would fall to the Germans. They met in Hotel Univers, which was bombed that same night. As Henry and William left, they were caught in heavy bombing in Tournai, and their car caught on fire. Henry was injured, requiring medical attention. Henry was usually quite an optimistic man, but he did suffer from bouts of depression, especially during the war. After the fall of Dunkirk, Henry was forced to return to England, after the army was unable to assure the king's brother's safety. In 1941, Henry was promoted to Lieutenant General, and in 1944 to General. Henry went on a 4-month-long military and diplomatic mission to the Middle East, India and East Africa in 1942. Henry was apprehensive about the trip. He had become a father for the first time, and the Germans were advancing quickly into the territories he would be visiting. Albert wrote to Alice to promise that he would act as guardian for Prince William should anything happen to Henry. The trip went fine and Henry was unharmed. However, later that year, when Prince George, Henry's younger brother, died in a plane crash, it was decided that Henry would not be sent on any further missions. In 1944, Henry was appointed Governor-General of Australia. After 2 years in the job, Henry resigned and returned to England. When the King, the Queen and their children went on a tour of South Africa, Henry acted as a Councillor of State for the King. Henry served in the office of the Lord High Commissioner to the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland a number of times. In 1952, the King died and Henry's niece Elizabeth ascended the throne as Queen Elizabeth II. The following year, his mother died, which saddened him, as he loved his mother. That same year, he attended the coronation of his niece. In 1955, Henry reached the rank of Field Marshal, and in 1958, he reached the rank of Marshal of the Royal Air Force. Henry acted on behalf of his niece a number of times, performing engagements with his wife. In 1957, he represented the Queen at the Malayan Declaration of Independence. In later years, Henry suffered from a series of strokes. The first occurred in 1965 while returning from Sir Winston Churchill's funeral. He had been driving with his wife in the car when it occurred, and it resulted in a car crash. He would have several more strokes, which left him confined to a wheelchair and unable to speak. In 1972, he could not attend his brother David's funeral, nor his son Richard's wedding. When his son William died in a plane crash, his wife did not tell him of the death, fearing it would only worsen his health, but he most likely found out from television coverage. Prince Henry passed away on the 10th of June 1974. The last surviving child of King George V. His second son, Prince Richard, succeeded him as the Duke of Gloucester. Prince George, Duke of Kent, was born on the 20th of December 1902 at York Cottage. He was educated at home by a tutor before following his brother Henry's footsteps to attend St. Peter's Court in Kent. When George was 13, he attended Naval College, first in Osborne and then in Dartmouth. He was promoted to sub-lieutenant in 1924 and lieutenant in 1926. He remained on active service until 1929. In 1929, George obtained his pilot's license and became the first member of the British royal family to cross the Atlantic Ocean by air. George became a Freemason in 1928. In 1939, he was elected Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England. After leaving active service, George then held posts at the Foreign Office and then the Home Office, working as a civil servant. George also went on engagements for his father. In 1931, George and his brother David went on a tour of South America. Despite having left the Navy, he continued to receive promotions to commander in 1934 and captain in 1937. In 1932, Prince George met Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark. They were second cousins and quickly fell in love. They got engaged in August 1934 and married on the 29th of November 1934 at Westminster Abbey. They had a Greek ceremony in the private chapel of Buckingham Palace afterwards. George was created Duke of Kent, Earl of St Andrews and Baron Downpatrick. Together they had 3 children, Edward born in 1935, Alexandra born in 1936 and Michael born in 1942. Throughout his marriage, there were rumours that George had affairs with several people, including Jessie Matthews, Cecil Roberts and Noel Coward. One relationship was confirmed, which was his relationship with Margaret Wigham, later Duchess of Argyll. George was rumoured to have had a son with Kiki Preston. In 1936, George's father died and his brother David became King Edward VIII of the United Kingdom. David appointed George his personal aide-de-camp. Following David's abdication at the end of 1936, George's brother Albert ascended the throne. Albert appointed George as his personal naval aide-de-camp. In 1937, George was commissioned as a colonel in the British Army and later appointed as Colonel-in-Chief of the Royal Fusiliers. In 1938, George was appointed Governor-General of Australia, but due to the outbreak of the Second World War, it was postponed. In 1939, months before the war, George gained the rank of Rear Admiral in the Royal Navy, Major General in the British Army, and Air Vice Marshal in the Royal Air Force. When the war began, George returned to active naval service. On the 25th of August 1942, George and 14 others flew from Invergordon, Ross and Cromarty to Iceland. George and 13 others were killed when the aircraft crashed on Eagles Rock near Dunbeath in Scotland. His death marked the first time in over 450 years that a member of the British royal family died while on active service. He was buried in the Royal Burial Ground in Frogmore. His eldest son, Prince Edward, succeeded him as Duke of Kent. His youngest child, Prince Michael, had been born only 7 weeks before George's death. Prince John of the United Kingdom was the youngest child of George V and Mary of Teck. He was born on the 12th of July 1905 at York Cottage on the Sandringham estate. When John was just 4 years old, he suffered his first epileptic seizure, and as time went on, his condition worsened. It was also possible that John was autistic, but he was never officially diagnosed during his lifetime. As his epilepsy worsened, a household was set up for John at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate. He lived there with his nanny, Charlotte Bell, who was nicknamed Lala. Winifred Thomas, a young girl with asthma, lived with John as a friend, and they played together every day. Thomas later recounted Prince John's excitement at seeing a zeppelin passing by, and Queen Mary being a loving and present parent who spent a lot of time with John. His grandmother, Queen Alexandra, also visited him often. For the most part, Prince John had a happy childhood. After turning 13, John's seizures worsened and became more frequent. On the 18th of January 1919, John had a severe seizure and passed away that afternoon from sudden, unexpected death in epilepsy. Though his parents were devastated by his death, they were grateful that his suffering had ended. Prince John was buried next to his uncle of the same name, who lived only 1 day. His grandmother Alexandra remarked to Mary that now our two Johnnies rest side by side.